The History of British India. Chapter 1. From the commencement of the efforts to begin a trade with India till the change of the company from a regulated to a joint stock company. The Portuguese had formed important establishments in India before the British offered themselves as competitors for the riches of the East. From the time when Vasco da Gama distinguished his nation by discovering the passage round the Cape of Good Hope, and first reached the coast of Hindustan, a whole century had elapsed, during which without a rival they had enjoyed and abused the advantages of superior knowledge and art amid a feeble and half-civilized race. They had explored the Indian Ocean as far as Japan, had discovered its islands, rich with some of the most favorite productions of nature, had achieved the most brilliant conquests, and by their commerce poured into Europe in unexampled profusion those commodities of the East on which the nations at that time set an extraordinary value. The circumstances of this splendid fortune had violently attracted the attention of Europe. The commerce of India, even when confined to those narrow limits which a carriage by land had prescribed, was supposed to have elevated feeble states into great ones, and to have constituted an enviable part in the fortune even of the most opulent and powerful, to have contributed largely to support the Grecian monarchies both in Syria and Egypt, to have retarded the downfall of Constantinople, and to have raised the small and obscure Republic of Venice to the rank and influence of the most potent kingdoms. The discovery, therefore, of a new channel for this opulent traffic, and the happy experience of the Portuguese, inflamed the cupidity of all the maritime nations of Europe, and set before them the most tempting prospects. An active spirit of commerce had already begun to display itself in England. The nation had happily obtained a full share of the improvement which had dawned in Europe, and the tranquil and economic reign of Elizabeth had been favorable both to the accumulation of capital and to those projects of private emoluments on which the spirit of commerce depends. A brisk trade and of considerable extent had been carried on during the greater part of the 16th century with the Netherlands, at that time the most improved and commercial part of Europe. The merchants of Bristol had opened a traffic with the Canary Islands, those of Plymouth with the coasts of Guinea and Brazil. The English now fished on the banks of Newfoundland, and explored the Sea of Spitzbergen for the sovereign of the waters. They engrossed, by an exclusive privilege, the commerce of Russia. They took an active part in the trade of the Mediterranean. The company of merchant adventurers pushed so vigorously the traffic with Germany and the central parts of Europe, as highly to excite the jealousy of the Hanse towns, and the Protestant inhabitants of the Netherlands and France, flying from the persecutions of their own oppressive and bigoted governments, augmented the commercial resources of England by the capital and skill of a large importation of the most ingenious and industrious people in Europe. In these circumstances, the lustre of the Portuguese transactions in the East peculiarly attracted the admiration of the English. Already a most adventurous spirit of navigation was roused in the nation. The English were the first who had imitated the example of the Spaniards in visiting the New World. In 1497, Cabot with a small squadron explored the coast of America from Labrador to Virginia, and discovered the islands of Newfoundland and St. John. An English merchant named Robert Thorn, who had been stationed for many years at Seville in Spain, and had acquired particular knowledge of the intercourse which the Portuguese had opened with the East, presented a project to Henry VIII. About the year 1527, the accomplishment of which he imagined would place his country in a situation no less enviable than that of the Portuguese. as that nation had obtained a passage to India by a course to the southeast, and pretended a right, which they defended by force, to its exclusive occupation, he supposed that his countrymen might reach the same part of the globe by sailing to the northwest, and thus obtain a passage at once expeditious and undisputed. What effect this representation produced on the mind of Henry is not accurately known. But 2 voyages in the course of his reign were undertaken for the discovery of a northwest passage, one about this period and another 10 years later. Nothing can more clearly prove to us the ardor with which the English coveted a share in the riches supposed to be drawn by the Portuguese from the East, than the persevering efforts which they made to discover a channel from which the Portuguese would have no pretence to exclude them. 2 attempts in the reign of Henry to obtain a passage by the northwest had failed. Their exploring fancy anticipated a happier issue from a voyage to the northeast. A small squadron, accordingly, under the direction of Sir Hugh Willoughby, was fitted out in the reign of Edward VI, and sailing along the coast of Norway, doubled the North Cape, where it was encountered by a storm. The ship of Sir Hugh was driven to an obscure spot in Russia Lapland, where he and his crew perished miserably by the climate. The other principal vessel found shelter in the harbor of Archangel, and was the first foreign ship by which it was entered. So well did Chancellor, the captain of the vessel, improve this incident, that he opened a commercial intercourse with the natives, visited the monarch in his capital, stipulated important privileges for his countrymen, and laid the foundation of a trade which was immediately prosecuted to no inconsiderable extent. This voyage but little damped the hopes of obtaining a northeast passage to the riches of India. Some vigorous attempts were made by the company in whose hands the commerce of Russia was placed, the last of them in 1580, when 2 ships were sent out to explore the passage through the Straits of Waigadz. After struggling with many perils and difficulties from the ice and the cold, one of the vessels returned unsuccessful, the other was never heard of more. Before this hope was regarded as desperate, the project of obtaining the passage by the northwest was resumed with ardor. No fewer than 6 voyages were made in the course of a few years. 2 barks of 25 tons each, and a pinnace of 10, sailed under Martin Frobisher in the year 1567, and entered Hudson's Bay, which at first they imagined was the inlet about to conduct them to the golden shore. The same navigator was encouraged to make a second attempt in the same direction in 1576. As he brought home in these voyages some minerals which were supposed to be impregnated with gold, the attention of the government was excited, and 2 years afterwards Frobisher was sent out with 15 of the Queen's ships, carrying miners for the supposed ore, and 120 persons as the rudiments of a colony. Having spent his provisions, and lost one of his ships, but not found the expected passage, nor left his settlers, he returned with 300 tons of the supposed treasure, which proved to be only a glittering sand. The nation persevered in its hopes and enterprises. A few years afterwards, Captain John Davis sailed as far as 66 degrees 40 minutes north, and discovered the straits distinguished by his name. In a second voyage, undertaken in 1586, he explored in vain the inlet which he had thus discovered. After a few years he was enabled to proceed in a third expedition, but had no better success than the preceding 2. After so many efforts to discover a new passage to India, the English resolved to be no longer deterred by the pretensions of the Portuguese. A voyage to China by the Cape of Good Hope was undertaken in 1582. 4 ships proceeded to the coast of Brazil, fought with some Spanish men of war, and were obliged to return for want of provisions. Another expedition consisting of 3 ships was fitted out in 1596. the commander of which was furnished with Queen Elizabeth's letter to the Emperor of China. This voyage proved eminently unfortunate. The ships were driven upon the coast of Spanish America, where only 4 men were preserved alive from the effects of storms, famine, and disease. Amid these unsuccessful endeavors 2 voyages were accomplished, which animated the hopes of the nation, and pointed out the way to more fortunate enterprises. Francis Drake, the son of a clergyman in Kent, who at a tender age had been put an apprentice to the master of a slender bark trading to the coast of Holland and France, had early evinced that passionate ardor in his profession which is the usual forerunner of signal success. He gained the affections of his master, who left him his bark at his death. At the age of 18 he was purser of a ship, which sailed to the Bay of Biscay. At 20 he made a voyage to the coast of Guinea. In 1565 he ventured all he possessed in a voyage to the West Indies, which had no success. And in 1567 he served under his kinsman Sir John Hawkins in his unprosperous expedition to the Bay of Mexico. In these different services his nautical skill, his courage, and sagacity had been conspicuously displayed. In 1570 his reputation enabled him to proceed to the West Indies with 2 vessels under his command. So bent was he on executing some great design that he renewed his visit the next year, for the sole purpose of obtaining information. He had no sooner returned than he planned an expedition against the Spaniards, executed it with 2 ships and 73 men, sacked the town of Nombre de Dios, and returned with great treasure. It is said that in this voyage he saw from the top of a high tree, i.e., fancied he saw across the American Isthmus, the Southern Ocean, and became inflamed with the desire of sailing to it in a ship of England. For this expedition he prepared on a great scale, obtaining the commission of the Queen and 5 vessels, one of 100 tons, another of 80, one of 50, another of 30, and a pinnace of 15, manned with 164 select sailors. The historians of this voyage were anxious to display the taste and magnificence as well as judgment of his preparations, expert musicians, rich furniture, utensils of the most curious workmanship, all the vessels of his table silver, and many of those of his cook room. The expedition sailed from Plymouth on the 13th of December, 1577. Having passed the Straits of Magellan and ravaged the western coast of Spanish America, Drake feared the encounter of a Spanish fleet should he attempt to return in the same direction, and formed the bold design of crossing the Pacific Ocean to India, and regaining England by the Cape of Good Hope. With 1 ship and only part of the fleet which remained, he steered along the coast of America to the latitude of 38° north, and then entered upon that immense navigation in which Magellan, the only circumnavigator who preceded him, had suffered so much. No memorable occurrence attended the voyage. Of the islands which have been discovered in the Pacific Ocean, none were observed till he approached the Asiatic coast. Fixing his attention on the Moluccas, of which the fame had been circulated in Europe by the rich spices thence imported by the Portuguese, he passed with little observation the more eastern part of the numerous islands which stud the Indian Sea, and held his course for Tidor. From intelligence received on the passage, he waived his intention of landing on that island, and steered for Ternate, the sovereign of which he understood to be at enmity with the Portuguese. The intercourse which he there commenced forms a remarkable epoch in the history of the British in India, as it was the beginning of those commercial transactions which have led to such important results. The king, having received assurances that his new visitants came with no other intention than that of trading with his country, gave them a very favorable reception. This monarch possessed considerable power, since the English navigators were informed that he ruled over 70 islands, besides Ternate, the most valuable of all the Moluccas, and in the visits which they paid to his court they were eyewitnesses that he could display no contemptible share of magnificence. They exchanged presents with him, received him on board, and traded with his subjects, laid in a cargo of valuable spices, and acquainted themselves with the nature and facilities of a commerce which was so much the object of admiration in Europe. Not satisfied with the information or the commodities which they received on one island, they visited several, being always amazed at their prodigious fertility, and in general delighted with the manners of the inhabitants. Among other places they landed in the great island of Java, famous afterwards as the seat of the Dutch government in India. They held some friendly intercourse with the natives, and departed with a tolerable knowledge both of the character of the people and the productions of the country. They now spread their sails for that navigation between Europe and India, to which the Portuguese claimed an exclusive right, and by which they monopolized the traffic with India. Those discoverers had craftily disseminated in Europe terrific accounts of dangers and horrors attending the navigation round the Cape of Good Hope. As the voyage of the English proved remarkably prosperous, they were surprised and delighted with the safety and ease which seemed to them to distinguish this envied passage, and conceived a still more lofty opinion of the advantages enjoyed by the nation that engrossed it. After leaving Java, the first land which they touched was the Cape of Good Hope. They landed once more at Sierra Leone, on the African coast, where they received such supplies as sufficed for the remainder of the voyage. They arrived at Plymouth on Monday, the 26th of September, 1580, after a voyage of 2 years, 10 months, and a few days, exhibiting to the wondering eyes of the spectators the first ship in England, and the second in the world, which had circumnavigated the globe. The news quickly spread over the whole kingdom, which resounded with the applause of the man who had performed so daring and singular an enterprise. Whoever wished to be distinguished as the patron of merit hastened to confer some mark of his admiration on Captain Drake. The songs, epigrams, poems, and other pieces, which were composed in celebration of his exploits, amounted to several collections. The queen, after some delay, necessary to save appearances with the Spanish court, which loudly complained of the depredations of Drake, though as reprisals perhaps they were not undeserved, paid a visit in person to the wonderful ship of Deptford, accepted of an entertainment on board, and conferred the honor of knighthood on its captain, observing at the same time that his actions did him more honor than his title. We may form some conception of the ardor which at that time prevailed in England for maritime exploits, by the number of men of rank and fortune who chose to forego the indulgences of wealth, and to embark their persons and properties in laborious, painful, and dangerous expeditions. Among them we find such names as those of the Earls of Cumberland and Essex, of Sir Richard Greenville, of Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Robert Dudley, who prepared squadrons at their own expense, and sailed to various parts of the world. No undertaking of this description was attended with more important circumstances than that of Thomas Cavendish. This gentleman descended from a family of distinction, and inheriting a large estate in the county of Suffolk, had been early fired with a passion for maritime adventure. In a vessel of his own, he had accompanied Sir Richard Greenville in his unsuccessful voyage to Virginia, and now sold or mortgaged his estate, to equip a squadron with which he might rival the glory of Drake. It consisted of 3 ships, the largest of 140 tons, one of 60, and a bark of about 40, supplied with 2 years' provisions, and manned with 126 officers and sailors, of whom several had served in the celebrated expedition of Drake. They sailed from Plymouth on the 21st of July, 1586. Their voyage through the Straits of Magellan, and the depredations which they proceeded to commit along the western coast of the American continent, not only in the spirit of avarice, but even of wanton devastation, form no part of our present subject, and may without regret be left to other inquirers. They had reached the coast of California, and nearly 24 degrees of northern latitude, when, having taken a very rich Spanish ship, and completed their schemes of plunder, they commenced their voyages across the Pacific Ocean. They left the coast of America on the 19th of November, and came in sight of Guam, one of the Ladrone Islands, on the 3rd of January. From this island they were visited by 60 or 70 canoes full of the inhabitants, who brought provisions to exchange for commodities, and so crowded about the ship that the English, when they had finished their traffic, discharged some of their firearms to drive them away. With the Philippines, to which they next proceeded, they opened a more protracted intercourse. They cast anchor at one of the islands, and lay there for 9 days, during which they carried on an active trade with the inhabitants. The cluster of islands to which the Europeans have given the name of the Philippines was discovered by Magellan. Philip II, shortly after his accession to the Spanish throne, planted there a colony of Spaniards by an expedition from New Spain, and a curious commerce had from that time been carried on across the great Pacific between this settlement and the dominions of Spain in the New World. To Manila, the capital of the Philippine colony, the Chinese, who resorted thither in great numbers, brought all the precious commodities of India, and 2 ships were sent annually from New Spain, which carried to the Philippines the silver of the American mines, and returned with the fine productions of the East. The impatience, however, of the natives under the Spanish yoke was easily perceived. When they discovered that the new visitors were not Spaniards, but the enemies of that people, they eagerly testified their friendship, and the princes of the island where Cavendish landed engaged to assist him with the whole of their forces, if he would return and make war upon the common adversary. This adventurous discoverer extensively explored the intricate navigation of the Indian archipelago, and observed the circumstances of the new and extraordinary scene with a quick and intelligent eye. He visited the Ladrones, pursued a roving course among the Philippines, which brought most of them within his view. He passed through the Moluccas, sailed along that important chain of islands, which, extending from the Strait of Malacca, bounds the Indian archipelago to the extremity of Timor, and passing the Strait of Bali between the 2 Javas, cast anchor on the southwest side of the great island of that name. He traded here with the natives for provisions, and formed with them a sort of treaty, stipulating a favorable reception whenever his visit should be renewed. He sailed for the Cape of Good Hope on the 16th of March, careful to treasure up information respecting a voyage which was now the channel of so important an intercourse. He made astronomical observations. He studied the weather, the winds, and the tides. He noted the bearing and position of lands, and omitted nothing which might facilitate a repetition of the voyage to himself or any of his countrymen. He passed the Cape with prosperous navigation about the middle of May, and having touched at St. Helena to recruit his stores, he landed at Plymouth on the 9th of September, 1588. In a letter which, on the very day of his arrival, he wrote to Lord Hudson, then Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth, he says, "I navigated to the islands of the Philippines, hard upon the coast of China, of which country I have brought such intelligence as hath not been heard of in these parts, a country the stateliness and riches, of which I fear to make report of, lest I should not be credited. I sailed along the islands of Moluccas, where among some of the heathen people I was well entreated, and where our countrymen may have trade as freely as the Portugals, if they themselves will. The tide of maritime adventure which these splendid voyages were calculated to increase flowed naturally towards India, by reason of the fancied opulence of the East, and the passion for Indian commodities which prevailed at that time in Europe. The impatience of our countrymen had already engaged them in a circuitous traffic with that part of the globe. They sailed to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, where they found cargoes of Indian goods conveyed overland, and a mercantile company, denominated the Levant Company, was instituted, according to the policy of the age, to secure to the nation the advantages of so important a commerce. The company, too, which, after the discovery of the port of Archangel, had been formed to carry on the trade with Russia, had opened a communication with Persia, whence they imported Indian goods to satisfy the demand of the English. Mr. Anthony Jenkinson, an active and enterprising agent of the Russia Company, sailed down the Volga in 1558 to the Caspian Sea, which he crossed into Persia, and at Bulgar, a city of some importance, found merchants from various parts of the Persian Empire, from Russia, from India, and China. This voyage he performed 7 times, and opened a considerable trade for raw and wrought silk, for carpets, spices, precious stones, and other Asiatic productions. In 1563 there was business enough to require the presence of 3 agents at Kasbin, the seat of the Persian court, and the traffic flourished for several years. Accidental circumstances contributed to enliven the admiration excited by the Indian trade. During that expedition to the coast of Spain, on which Sir Francis Drake was sent by Queen Elizabeth to harass the Spanish shipping, and prevent as far as possible the preparations for the Invincible Armada, he took one of the Portuguese ships from India, known at that time by the name of Carracks. The value of her cargo inflamed the imagination of the merchants, and the papers which she carried afforded information respecting the traffic in which she was engaged. A still more important capture of the same sort was made in 1593. An expedition fitted out for the West Indies by Sir Walter Raleigh, and commanded by Sir John Burroughs, encountered near the Azores the greatest of all the Portuguese carracks, a vessel of 1,600 tons, carrying 700 men and 36 brass cannon, and, after an obstinate contest, carried her into Dartmouth. She was the largest vessel ever seen in England, laden with spices, calicoes, silk, gold, pearls, drugs, porcelain, ebony, etc., and by her riches inflamed the impatience of the English to be engaged in so opulent and brilliant a commerce. Some members of the Turkey or Levant Company finished about the same time an expedition into India. They had carried some cloth, tin, and other goods from Aleppo to Baghdad, which they next conveyed down the Tigris to Ormuz in the Persian Gulf, and thence transported to Goa, the great mart between the Portuguese and Indians on the coast of Malabar. From this place they commenced an extensive survey of the adjoining countries, repaired to Agra, at that time the capital and residence of the Mogul Emperor, visited Lahore, traversed Bengal, travelled to Pegu and Malacca, and returning by sea to Ormuz, retraced their steps to Aleppo, whence they sailed for England, bearing with them important and extensive information respecting the countries they had explored. Intelligence now poured itself upon the nation by a variety of channels. An Englishman of the name of Stevens had sailed with the Portuguese from Lisbon to Goa by the Cape of Good Hope, and wrote an account of his voyage, which was read with avidity, and contributed to swell the general current of enterprise which now ran so vehemently toward India. The first application which was made to government was by a memorial in the name of divers merchants, addressed to the Lords of Council in 1589, for the royal permission to send 3 ships and as many pinnaces on a voyage to India. They enumerated the different places at which the Portuguese had already effected settlements, on the coast of Malabar and Coromandel, in Malacca, and in the Banta and Molucca Islands, places from which it seemed to be tacitly understood that other nations were bound to abstain. But they added that the islands and shores of the Indian Ocean presented many other places which were open to the enterprise of the English merchants, and from an intercourse with which the nation might reap the greatest advantage. What reception this application received is little known. But the unfortunate expedition of Captain Raymond, remarkable as being the first of which India was the immediate destination, though its object was not so much trade as plunder, by cruising against the Portuguese, was fitted out in 1591. Disease had made such ravages among the crews before they reached the Cape of Good Hope, that one of the vessels was obliged to be sent home with the sick, and the rest, 2 in number, had not long doubled the Cape, when the principal ship was lost in a storm. Captain James Lancaster, in the remaining vessel, after a disastrous voyage to the east, sailed to the West Indies, where he lost the ship, and with great difficulty found means to return in a French privateer. But while the English fluctuated between desire and execution in this important project, the Dutch, in 1595, boldly sent 4 ships to trade with India by the Cape of Good Hope. This expedition added fuel at once to the jealousy and ambition of the English. In 1599 an association was formed and a fund subscribed, which amounted to £30,133 6s. 8d, and consisted of 101 shares, the subscription of individuals varying from £100 to £3,000. It was agreed to petition the Queen for a warrant to fit out 3 ships and export bullion, and also for a charter of privileges. A committee of 15, the origin and foundation of the Court of Directors, were chosen to manage. The approbation of the government was readily signified, but as a treaty was then pending with Spain, policy counselled delay. The subscribers, known by the name of the adventurers, were impatient, and presented a memorial, setting forth the places with which the Spaniards and Portuguese had established an intercourse, and pointed out other parts to which, without any ground of complaint on the part of those nations, the English might with unspeakable advantage resort. The council replied that it was more beneficial for the general state of merchandise to entertain a peace than that the same should be hindered by the standing with ye Spanish commissions for the maintaining of this trade, to forego the opportunity of the concluding of the peace. The memorial was referred to Sir Fulk Greville, who made a favourable report. And in the course of the same year, the Queen sent John Mildenhall overland by Constantinople on an embassy to the Mogul. It was attended with little success. The Portuguese and Venetian agents exerted themselves to raise suspicions against the designs of the English, and effectually obstructed the endeavours of the ambassador. Towards the end of the year 1600, the efforts of the adventurers were renewed. The consent of government to proceed in preparation for an Indian voyage was obtained, while the patent of incorporation was still under consideration. Meanwhile an application was made from government, with what view does not appear, for the employment of Sir Edward Michelborne in the expedition. The answer of the committee, whose situation, that of petitioner for a favor not yet conceded, might have counselled complaisance, affords a curious specimen of their independence and of the mode of thinking of the times. They stated it as their resolution not to employ any gentleman in any place of charge, and requested that they may be allowed to sort their business with men of their own quality, lest the suspicion of the employment of gentlemen being taken hold upon by the generalities do drive a greater number of the adventurers to withdraw their contributions. The adventure was prosecuted with ardor. On the 8th of October, the 5 following ships were already provided: the Malus Scourge, of 200 men and 600 tons burden; the Hector, of 100 men and 300 tons; the Ascension, of 80 men and 260 tons; the Susan, of 80 men and 240 tons; a Pinnace, of 40 men and 100 tons. To provision these ships for 20 months the cost was computed at £6,600 4s. 10d., and the cargo, consisting of iron and tin, wrought and unwrought, of lead, cloths, and some smaller articles, chiefly intended as presents for the persons in power in the different places at which the ships might touch, was estimated exclusive of bullion at £4,545. It was determined that 36 factors or supercargoes should be appointed for the voyage, divided into separate classes, rising above one another in trust and emoluments. Captain James Lancaster, whose difficult return from a predatory expedition to the Indian seas has already been mentioned, was chosen to command the fleet; and on the 31st of December the charter of privileges was obtained. This charter, the origin of a power so anomalous and important as that which was afterwards accumulated in the hands of the East India Company, contained nothing which remarkably distinguished it from the other charters of incorporation so commonly in that age bestowed upon trading associations. It constituted the adventures of a body politic and corporate by the name of the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading to the East Indies, and vested them with the usual privileges and powers. The plan which they had already adopted for the management of their affairs, by a committee of 24 and a chairman, both to be chosen annually, was confirmed and rendered obligatory, with a reservation in favor of the rights granted to other associations, and with prohibition extending to all such places as might be already occupied by the subjects of states in amity with her Majesty, and whose objection to rivals should be declared, the privilege of trading to the East Indies, that is, to all places beyond the Cape of Good Hope and the Straits of Magellan, was bestowed upon the Company, with the power to export in every voyage £30,000 in gold and silver, to export English goods for the first 4 voyages exempt from duties, and to re-export Indian goods into English ships under the same privilege to the end of the charter. According to the principle of the times, the charter was exclusive, prohibiting the rest of the community from trading within the limits, but granting to the Company the power, whenever they pleased, of bestowing licenses for that purpose. It was granted for a period of 15 years, but under condition that, if not found to be advantageous to the country, it might be annulled at any time after a notice of 2 years. If advantageous to the country, it might, if desired by the Company, be renewed for 15 years. The ardor of individuals, where anything is to be risked, is more easily excited than upheld. Though the list of subscribers, while the scheme of Indian adventure was yet only in contemplation, had been readily filled up, the calls of the committees for the payment for the installments were very imperfectly obeyed. Even when the charter was obtained, it was either understood to confer no power of compelling payment, or the directors were afraid to make use of that power. Instead of extracting the stipulated sums and trading upon the terms of the joint stock company, the subscribers who were disposed to adventure were invited to take upon themselves the expense of the voyage, and as they sustained the whole of the risk, to reap the whole of the profit. The sums which were thus advanced amounted to £68,373, which greatly exceeded the capital originally subscribed. Of this, £39,771 was expended in the purchase and equipment of ships. The four, excluding the pinnace, which were taken up by the committee of original adventurers, £28,742 was expended in bullion, and £6,860 in goods, consisting partly of British commodities, cloth, lead, tin, cutlery, glass, etc., partly of foreign, as quicksilver, Muscovy hides, etc. The choice of Captain Lancaster to command the fleet was renewed, and it sailed from Torbay on the 2nd of May, 1601, carrying letters of recommendations from the Queen to the sovereigns of the different ports to which it might resort. A first and experimental attempt was naturally unproductive of any remarkable result, but the first voyage of the East Indian Company was not discouraging. The first place to India to which the fleet repaired was Akin, a principal city in the island of Sumatra, at which they were favorably received. They formed a treaty of commerce with the chief or sovereign of the place, obtained permission to erect a factory, and having taken on board a quantity of pepper, set sail for the Moluccas. In the Straits of Malacca they captured a Portuguese vessel of 900 tons burthen, carrying calicoes and spices, which sufficed to lade them. They diverted their course, therefore, to Bantam in the island of Java, where the captain, delivering his letters and presents, and meeting with a favorable reception, left some agents, the first rudiments of the company's factories, and returned to England, where he arrived in September 1603, with a handsome profit to his owners on the capital of the voyage. In the course of the years from 1603 to 1613, 8 other voyages were fitted out on similar terms. The first in 1603, under the command of Captain Middleton, consisted of the ships which had but just returned from the preceding voyage, and the capital subscribed was £60,450, of which £48,140 was laid out in the preparation and provision of the ships, £11,160 in bullion, and £1,142 in goods. The second, in 1606, consisted of 3 ships commanded by Captain Keeling, capital £53,500, of which £28,620 was for the equipment of the fleet, £17,600 bullion, and £7,280 goods. The third, in 1607, consisted of 2 ships, £33,000 capital, £14,600, of which for the ships £15,000 bullion, and £3,400 in goods. The fourth voyage, in 1608, had but 1 ship, £13,700, subscription, expense of equipment £6,000, bullion £6,000, goods £1,700. The fifth, in 1609, had 3 ships, larger than any other former voyage, capital subscribed £82,000, cost of shipping £32,000, the investment £28,500 bullion, and £21,300 goods. The sixth voyage, in 1610, had 4 ships, and subscription £71,581, divided into 42,500 pounds for shipping, 19,200 pounds bullion, 10,081 pounds goods. The seventh in 1611, of 4 vessels, had 76,355 pounds subscription, expended 48,700 pounds on the fleet, 17,675 pounds in bullion, and 10,000 pounds in goods. The eighth in 1612 had 1 ship, and subscription 7,200 pounds, divided 5,300 pounds for the vessel, 1,250 pounds bullion, and 650 pounds in goods. All these voyages, with one exception, that in 1607, of which both the vessels were lost, were prosperous, the clear profits hardly ever below 100%, being in general more than 200 on the capital of the voyage. The years in which these voyages were performed were not without other incidents of considerable importance. In 1604, the company were alarmed by a license in violation of their charter, granted to Sir Edward Michaelborne and others, to trade to Cathay, China, Japan, Korea, and Cambaya, etc. This injury was compensated in 1609, when the facility and indiscretion of James encouraged the company to aim at a removal of those restrictions which the more cautious policy of Elizabeth had imposed. They obtained a renewal of their charter, confirming all their preceding privileges, and constituting them a body corporate, not for 15 years, or any other limited time, but for ever still. However, providing that on experience of prejudice to the nation, their exclusive privileges should, after 3 years' notice, cease and expire. The earliest of the company's voyages were exclusively directed to the islands in the Indian Ocean, as Sumatra, Java, and Amboyna, the returns being raw silk, fine calicoes, indigo, cloves, and mace. In 1608, the factors at Bantam and in the Moluccas reported that the cloths and calicoes imported from the continent of India were in great request in the islands, and recommended the opening of a trade at Surat and Cambaya to supply them with those commodities which might be exchanged with extraordinary profit for the spice and other productions of the islands. To profit by these advantages, the fleet which sailed under the orders of Sir Henry Middleton in 1609 was directed to steer to the western coast of the Asiatic continent, where they made several attempts to establish a commercial intercourse. At Aden and Mocha they were opposed by the Turks, who surprised one of the ships and made the captain and 70 men prisoners. On the coast of India their endeavors were frustrated by the influence of the Portuguese. A fleet which sailed in 1611 had better success, though attacked at Swally, a place at no great distance from Surat, by a large Portuguese armament. It made a successful defense, and, notwithstanding the intrigues and efforts of the Portuguese, obtained a favorable reception at Surat. The English now succeeded in forming a commercial arrangement. They obtained permission to establish factories at Surat, Ahmedabad, Cambaya, and Goga, which were pointed out by the agents of the company as the best situations. Agreeing to a duty of 3.5%, they stipulated that this should be the only exaction to which their merchandise should be exposed, that protection should be afforded to their factories and their property, even in the case of the death of their agents, secured till the arrival of the following fleet. The Purmon, or decree of the Emperor conferring these privileges, was received on the 11th of January, 1612. This was the first establishment of the English on the continent of India, at that time the seat of one of the most extensive and splendid monarchies on the surface of the globe.